listening to episode 126 of Mitolife Radio. I'm your host, Matt Blackburn, and today I'm interviewing Daniel DeBaun of Defender Shield. Daniel wrote a book called Radiation Nation, The Fallout of Modern Technology, and I like the layout of the book. It's really well organized, easy to understand for a layperson that has never looked into this. Really good for a skeptic to read this book, because I know there are a lot of people that just scoff at the idea that, say, AirPods or Bluetooth headsets cause any harm, or the watches or all the other devices. People will generally laugh in the mainstream when you start talking about the harm that these modern devices, these modern technologies cause, because the government said they're safe. But in reality, the government in certain countries around the world, like in Europe, actually have standards that are stricter than ours. So I think there's this misconception that the standard for safety of electromagnetic field exposure across the board worldwide is the same, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Some countries are so strict that it talks about in the book that they actually go as far as to ban towers being put on schools and churches and public buildings, because that's what's happening here in the States. They're putting cell towers and 5G towers right on the top of like churches and schools where people congregate for hours. And that's where I think there's definitely, foul play at work and kind of a plan to make people sick, because it's really about exposure time and about distance from the emitting device. So I'll let Daniel explain it. Really knowledgeable guy. I had a lot of fun picking his brain, and he even answers a pretty extensive question and answer that listeners sent in. So here we go. Here's Daniel DeBaun. Enjoy the interview. All right, Daniel DeBaun, welcome to the show.
Matt, thanks so much for inviting me. I look forward to chatting with your listening audience about a subject we're pretty passionate about, both you and me.
Yeah, and definitely. I although I've been studying it for quite a while, like about a decade, very humble, because I think there are a lot of like quote unquote experts in this like biohacking or health field, natural health field, that talk about EMFs, and they're like throwing like 10 devices at people. And I try to stay mostly with foundational stuff. Like if people want to explore other technologies and stuff, that's cool. But the blocking aspect that you've brought with like your company, Defender Shield, is very practical. Like I use dirty electricity filters. Those are very practical. It's all measurable. Your stuff is measurable.
Right, exactly. And it's based on science.
Always good.
Always good.
So how long have you been into this, the study of electromagnetic fields and the effects on the human body, and how do you get into it and all that?
Matt, sort of interesting what happened. I was actually an engineer for the Bell system, and I was in Bell Labs and the evolution of Bell Labs. And what was interesting is I was responsible for developing the standards for the telecom network. And then I also was responsible for making sure that if people built technology to fit into the network, I would test it to make sure it's compliant to the standards that we developed. So I had years and years and years of sort of experience with this world. And what was really interesting at the time when I was doing it, Matt, was that I was always worried about one piece of electronics interfering with another piece of electronics. And so I had a pretty good understanding of what the interfering signals look like, because we wanted to make sure that the technologies could handle those interferences and operate properly for the network. So I started in the labs, and I worked quite a number of years working my way through the technology industry and managed it ultimately at the end, towards the end of my career. Well, about 10 years ago, maybe a bit more now, my sons were visiting me, and they're men in their, at the time, mid-30s. And they had their laptops in their lap, and they had it on for hours at a time. So my wife says, that can't be good for you. There's got to be something bad going on, and somehow that energy that's coming and being emitted off of this laptop is going to prevent you from having children, and I want grandchildren. So that's what she said. And I'm thinking to myself, the power levels of that signal are so low, there's no way there's any interference. And I had a fairly good understanding what those emissions were. And it turns out I paused a bit and I said, maybe I'll look into that. I had never looked at the influence of electromagnetic radiation to a human. And it didn't take me very long to find out. After about 3 to 4 hours, the male sperm count, or the male sperm tends to become immobile and is debilitated from these emissions. And I was like sort of stunned. I didn't know that. And I've been in the industry for years and years and years. So I began looking further into it. And there's no question about it. For the last 50 years, science was looking at this very question and actually making some pretty profound comments about its impact to the body. Yet, Matt, you and I didn't know about it. And again, I was in the industry and we didn't know. And that's how I started, literally becoming the expert that we are. We wrote a book, my son and I, about the subject. And it was based on science work I had done my whole life.
That's amazing. And I'd imagine there's a lot of interference with special interests and like conflict of interest, like Apple, these huge corporations, AT&T, Verizon, the phone companies, because they kind of pull the reins on like major media news articles, right? Because if one's published that shows their product in a bad light, like, hey, this watch that you're wearing may or may not be the best thing for your health.
Right. Yeah. Actually, Matt, it's been true for so many industries for so many years. If you look at the smoking industry, and I often use the example where I at 12 years old, was stealing the cigarettes out of my father's drawer, and I was smoking it. And at the time, I wanted to be a big man because the advertisements were, you're going to be a big man if you can smoke a cigarette. And that's over 40 years ago, actually much more than that. And but ironically, at that time, science had already linked smoking a cigarette to lung cancer, yet no one knew it. So, in other words, it takes years and years and years for the community, the medical community, particularly, to understand the problem, and then it takes many years beyond that to change the common knowledge of us in general. And in the smoking, as you may recall, the reason why it became clear and evident was they were brought to court. I remember back in the 70s, there was a doctor, there was the head of Philip Morris was sitting in front of several pediatricians. And the pediatricians asked the question, well, is smoking bad for a pregnant woman? And he said, absolutely not. And then he thought about it a little bit, and he said, the baby may be a little bit smaller, but what woman wouldn't want a smaller baby? And so the mentality at that time was that, even though we were beginning to understand the implications, that nothing was done about it. And it took that many years to do it. Well, that's identical to the telecom. Telecom probably is the single largest industry in the world in terms of generating revenue. And they have a whole bunch of money to influence the media, and they do. At the same time, probably over the last 10, 15 years or so, all of the federally funded projects that were evaluating the linkages potentially between cell phones and the environment for nature as well as human just hasn't existed. So the only work we really have has been what's being privately done in universities and other spaces, but the federal government doesn't spend any money or hasn't spent any money on this for so many years. Yet the industry is learning, the independent studies are learning that there are these linkages, and they do impact our environment, and us included.
Yeah, one of the most fascinating parts that I've read in your book so far was that the side of the head they found in a study, the side of the head that the phone is held up to has increased glucose like uptake or metabolism, which I question. I think you said in the book, we're not sure why. And I wonder if that's like a protective mechanism. The cells are trying to increase energy.
Matt, actually, it turns out, and I think we'll probably talk about this more, but the body responds to electromagnetic radiation, the stuff from our cell phones, the stuff from our laptops, from our tablets, from our Wi-Fi. There's so many sources that our body does react to it. And you may have heard of it as oxidative stress. Oxidative stress is when there's an imbalance between the free radicals and the antioxidants. Well, that's just a sort of a byproduct. The cell is really reacting with a fight or flight response. It's called the cell danger response, CDR. And you're right, that's exactly right. But so we know the body's reacting, and that's a good example of why and how it does it. But what's interesting about that point about a cell phone to the head, the standards were probably 35 years or more old. And at that time, we did not have cell phones. Of course, we could not afford cell phones. Cell phones were almost bricks that we walked around with to communicate with each other. And I often point out, if I had a cell phone, my friends wouldn't have it because they couldn't afford it. So the use of a cell phone was very, very low at the time. The standards were developed using the military on the average 6-foot male. And what the standard said is that we don't want this signal penetrating the head by some depth, and we don't want it to heat up by some degree. And 1.6 watts per kilogram was established by the FCC somewhat 35 years ago, and it was based on an average 6-foot male with a signal that can't penetrate more than 1 to 2 inches into the head and not heat up that area of the head by 2 degrees on occasional use. Well, occasional use, as we said before, is no one had phones, so we didn't have much use. Fast forward to today, you have your 6-year-old child that has a cell phone talking to the grandma. You have your teenage daughter or son, can't get them off the phone. They're talking to their friends all day and all night. You have a bunch of women that chit chat with each other all day. So the 6-foot male average represented 3% of the marketplace. That other 97, it's all of us others that don't fit the 6-foot male. So when you talk about a standard that was developed 35 years ago, not allowing a signal to go in by more than 1 to 2 inches, that same signal today goes completely through a young child's head because the membranes, the blood-brain barrier, all the stuff that gets interfering with that signal just doesn't exist on a small child. And use, rather than a few minutes a day, it's a few hours a day. And it's at a very young age. So the standards really, I'm not sure, apply at all for the kind of use we have today. So sort of interesting. And by the way, when you talk about heating up, what are we talking about? Well, when you take a piece of meat and put it in the microwave oven, what happens is the water between the cells heat up and the cells oscillate. And voila, you have a cooked piece of meat. Well, an RF signal, a cell phone signal, a Wi-Fi signal, radio frequency signal, and a microwave are synonymous. They're the same thing. It is a microwave transmitted signal. And the only difference is with a microwave, it's more power than a cell phone. But it's heating it up because it's transmitted signal known to be a thermal emitting signal.
I'm glad you brought that up because when people hear EMF, they just think maybe electric, magnetic, and that's it. But it's a huge umbrella term that includes RF and even turned electricity and a bunch of other things, right?
Oh, absolutely. It is a microwave signal.
Mhm.
It is literally a microwave signal. A microwave is 2.4 gigahertz, and a cell phone, no, a Wi-Fi is 2.4 gigahertz. A microwave is 2.3 gigahertz. It's almost the identical frequency rate. The power levels are different. That's it. But it is literally a microwave signal.
Wow. I remember years ago, I was watching my friend's apartment and there were like 20 Wi-Fi signals in the
Yeah.
apartment. I felt sick after a few days. So I'm wondering, do they, I would imagine they stack, right? Like the more, like an apartment seems to be the worst with Wi-Fi.
Um, when you smell gasoline or you smell perfume, do you get a headache?
Um, a little bit. I mean, my head
Yeah,
definitely
not
feels a
much,
little
but a
weird.
little bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hmm.
So that is a body response. It's the body's basically saying, there's a toxin I can feel. And the way I'm going to demonstrate that I feel that way is I'm going to make my head hurt. Well, that's multiple chemical sensitivity. That's you're sensitive to the environment. Well, if you and that's about 15 to 20% of the population. One form or another, I get a little bit of a headache. Some people, it's debilitating. It gets pretty serious. Well, it turns out that electromagnetic radiation also creates an analogous thing. They call it electro hypersensitivity. And about 15 to 20% of all of us can feel it in one form or another. So we get maybe a little headache, our eyes may hurt a little bit, we may have a little bit of foggy thinking. There are many, many symptoms associated with what is considered electro hypersensitivity. And that's quite a few people, 20% of us. And by the way, 80% of that is women, which we don't know why, but it's true. So we are feeling it in general more and more, but at the same time, it's because our environment is changing and we have it more and more in our environment.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I definitely feel it. I think that's part of the reason why we moved out here to the woods to be,
Yeah.
off grid, which is the extreme. I don't think everyone has to do that. But when I go to a big city where everyone has 8 devices or whatever, I definitely feel all those signals bouncing around and um, things like hats, silver embedded hats are really invaluable to me because I
Yeah.
feel protected.
Well, think of it this way, Matt. Here's an analogy. If you have one bee in the room, if it stings you, unless you're allergic, you're going to brush it off. But if there are 1,000 bees in the room, they can get pretty dicey for you if they sting you. And that's literally what happens in our environment today. When you go into a city environment, you have the routers, you have the all individual cell phones. Your cell phone can transmit a cell tower signal, a Bluetooth signal, and a Wi-Fi signal. There are literally three bees coming out of that one device. So as you point out, you're in the woods, no bees there, and that means your environment is pretty clean. but for those others who live in metropolitan areas, they're ambient. The stuff around them is all those bees in play, and it is more effective at disrupting the body performance than they would be in your environment. So it's definitely something you need to be aware of.
That's a great point about the three Bs from the cell phone. That's one of the first things I think I became aware of maybe 5 or so years ago, to switch off cellular data. If you have like an iPhone,
Right.
turn off Bluetooth. Don't keep, because a lot of people probably keep on Bluetooth and Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
I'd imagine 90% of people do that. Just
Matt, you've taken three Bs and made it one B. It's really literally choice, and you don't even realize it. But one of the easiest ways to eliminate the bees is turn them off. It's clean up your environment by turning them off.
And then people would say that doesn't really make a difference because everyone else around you, but it's really, I mean, there's is it called the inverse square law, the
Right,
distance. So
right, right.
whatever's on your body, like your Wi-Fi router, your cell phone, like take care of that first, kind of thing.
Yeah, well, actually, there are 2 points you're making. The first point is, um, if you have a cell phone to your head, you have 1.6 watts per kilogram going into your head. If you move it away 1 to 2 feet, 80% of the danger of that cell phone is gone by 4 foot 98. So when you move something away from you, you really do um, reduce the potential dangers to the human body. But the other point you were making is about the ambient. Um, you have three transmitters coming out of the cell phone here. You have your laptop that has a Bluetooth transmitter and a Wi-Fi transmitter for your mouse and for the Wi-Fi router connection. And all of a sudden, you start looking into all these transmitters in the room, and it becomes a lot. In fact, if you go into a classroom today, there was zero presence of RF signals, as recently as 10 years ago. If you go into a classroom today that has Wi-Fi and laptops and tablets, the power level, the signal level in that room could be up as high as 0.5 watts. And as I mentioned before, Wi-Fi, your cell phone can be 1.6 watts. And think about that. The standard protects you at 1.6 watts. And time duration has an impact on what that device is doing to your body. And a classroom that has 0.5 watts, it's all day. With kids, that exposes them to that all day. And really, we don't know fully what that means, but we have pretty angry, tense, depressed kids in our classroom today. And one of the questions has always been recently is it the influence of the changed toxin environment from electromagnetic radiation? Think of it this way, Matt. If I put a 55-gallon drum in one corner of the room it was full of gasoline, and it was open and it was pouring into the room. And then on the other side, I had a guy welding and fumes were coming out of the weld. And in the back, I had a Wi-Fi. Which one is worse? Well, the World Health Organization doesn't make a difference. They're all considered to be carcinogenics, possible linkage to cancer. And Matt, would you want your kids smelling the gasoline in the front? Would you want your kids smelling the fumes from a welder? No, of course not. Well, it's basically considered the same exposure with a router. So it's sort of interesting how we sort of accept some things, but not others. But it is getting worse, not better.
Right. Does that 0.5 watts, like that chronic exposure, I'm still trying to wrap my head around this because I know with like grounding and earthing, and I got into Clinober like a decade ago and all that, earthing, just touching the barefoot on the grass or whatever, the beach. and that whole body voltage drop whenever you equalize with the earth. Does being exposed to Wi-Fi just like slowly increase your voltage, or is
So
it?
yeah, let's talk about grounding so we
Mm,
have a common
mm,
understanding of it. Um, Grounding's sort of a good thing. The body acts like a capacitor. In other words, it absorbs stuff around it. And then when you go onto a grounding pad or grass or sand or anything that's a good ground to the earth, that the body discharges what it doesn't need. So um, that's sort of a good thing. Yeah, that's sort of what's happening. It's literally your body's acting in capacitor. You feel better because now everything's more in balance. Um, if you had a cell phone to your head, you could still get frontal lobe cancer because it's a signal that's constant all the time you're using it to your head. So it really sort of depends. And the body does absorb the electromagnetic radiation to some extent, but the higher stuff, the RF stuff, the extremely low frequency stuff, like from your walls in your house or from the cables that are running in front of your home, they do not ground. Believe it or not, those signals can't look, it's not looking for ground. It's only the RF. But don't be misled in believing that everything is safe. You can have all the bees you want, but you're grounded, doesn't mean you're safe.
Yeah, a lot of people have that mentality. That's a really good point. And I interviewed Dave Stetzer. I think he's out in Wisconsin. He was studying like farm animals, milk production, farm, you know, animal production with EMFs and how it lowers.
Yes.
And he had some really interesting points about grounding. He was saying farmers got, I think, prostate cancer from being barefoot right below power lines. So that grounding is
Yeah.
not like a blanket good
Right,
thing.
exactly. And in that case, the short to ground is you. Right? And that's not necessarily a good thing. In fact, you got to be careful. I believe in floating ground, but I don't necessarily believe in ground where they
Mhm,
goes down to the earth. And it depends on the applications,
mhm,
but there are differences. But people who think they're safe, they're not, because there could potentially be excess ground, which you got to be concerned about, because now all of a sudden there's an imbalance, an electrical imbalance, which
mhm,
may have an impact to the electrical human body performance.
mhm. Yeah, I think how he described it is like all the electrons in the influence of non-native EMF get like pushed to one side of the body, I think he said, and then when you ground, it kind of equalizes. I don't know if that's accurate.
It may be. I think there are a lot of theories. What I do know is it can be excessive.
Mhm,
And also, what I know is if you have a router next to your head or you have a cell phone next to your head and they're transmitting, you're no safer with that with
mhm,
ground than not having ground. It is still dangerous signals because of the transmitted power of that signal.
mhm. Do you think it, just to finish up on grounding, do you think it's better to have to combine like shielded clothing or bedding, something like that, or blanket with the grounding? Or do you think it's better to do one or the other? Because it gets a little complicated, right? With that.
Yeah, yeah, there is a debate about, uh, there are mats, grounding mats for beds. And some really believe it's a very good product to have. But I can maybe describe circumstances where it may not be. For example, um, there is always concern for excessive ground, which is what I mentioned before, too much capacitance, too much lost. That's always an imbalance that can occur. But remember, it's a grounding pad. Lightning likes grounding pads. And so there's a reason that you got to be cautious about attracting your environment. If you have a cell tower right outside the window of your apartment and you have a grounding pad and you're sleeping between that that antenna and the grounding pad, I don't know. I don't think it's so good for you. And it really is not. So you really have to know the application to understand its benefit. In general, grounding's okay, but you want to be careful that it's not excessive.
That's a great point. Yeah, when I was down in Southern California, I lived there for 30 years and I was driving a lot. I was like a delivery driver and doing taxis and stuff. And my strategy was just to go to the beach and go barefoot in the wet sand a few days a week at sunset. And that made a huge difference.
Matt, that simple action is more than enough. It really does. You get the discharge you're looking for. It's not imbalanced, and actually you're pretty stable for some time to come until the next time you go to the beach. So actually, it's a pretty smart way to do it.
Mm-hmm. And that's a free thing.
And by the way, you're getting sun at the same time, so you're getting your vitamin D.
Right. Yeah, and all the hormonal benefits.
Right.
Exactly.
Exactly.
The light hit your eye and...
Exactly.
Yeah, those are great points. Yeah, I think people oversimplify this subject, which is one of the reasons why I was excited to have you on, whether it be grounding or mitigation. And they just kind of, all you need is a sticker on your phone or this, sacred geometry sticker or this crystal, which I went through my phases of all of that. And I never really felt a difference with any of it.
Yeah, it's funny. Sometimes they talk about science I don't understand. And my background, of course, is mechanical engineering for years and years. So there are terms and things I just don't understand. But more importantly, they use ways of describing what the product does that's very misleading. For example, I know there's one product that says, look at the difference in the congestion of the red blood cells. Okay, so they're arguing that there's a change in the red blood cell pattern. There may be, but how about the cell in the frontal lobe of the brain? The blood may change, and you can put the sticker on, or this product that you say you're using, and that the blood is less sticky, but you're still frying the cell of the brain. The membrane is penetrated by calcium because it fatigued against the demand presented by the power levels, and there's still oxide build-out, and they're mutating cells. So I don't understand what they're talking about. And as you point out, so many that make the claims, I'm not sure an indirect observation is an accurate observation. Who gives a shit about the cell phone? The red blood cell, if it has nothing to do with the cell itself and its damage to the cell.
Good point. Yeah, there's only so much you can see in a dark field microscope, right?
Right. Like exactly. Yeah, right. And it's a shot. It's a time shot, right? It's when did you take it? When did you look at it? And what does it really mean? Yeah. And there's you're right. There's a lot of claims made, but you really do. If you're interested in looking at products that bring the safety that you're hopeful for, make sure that there's a third-party independent laboratory that understands electromagnetic radiation, and let them decide if the technology that they claim works. But very rarely do you see anybody that's in that business going to electrical shops that understand the electronic problem and giving you an observation from their test labs of the performance of that electronics. So I do recommend they really do look for that, because that's the only way you can know if it's effective or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I like to kind of separate too, like active versus passive EMF protection. And like passive is like stickers and stuff, like non-powered. And some devices are powered, but you still have to question their efficacy.
Yeah. And those are the ones that are doing indirect stuff. They're making claims indirect. I can take my cell phone, I can put it in my chest, and you can push my arm down, right? Well, that's a parlor trick. It does. We know it affects the muscle. We know that. But is it long-term, and is it something to worry about? I don't know if it is or not. Studies suggest it may be, and you need to decide. And it's not going to be, if your arm can be pushed down more easily than not before you make decisions on spending money. So we both agree, I think.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I like that you brought up the calcium because I'm trying to get Martin Paul on the show. I've heard him on my friend Extreme Health Radio and other podcasts, and the whole calcium ion channel opening, calcium flooding into the
Yeah.
cell. It's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Matt, I really love his work because he shows the mechanical breakdown of the cell and how it occurs. And as I mentioned before, the membrane of the cell, a modern cell phone Wi-Fi transmission is a digital signal. It's on, it's off, it's on, it's off. So it's hitting on and off, hitting the cell. Okay. So if I take a 10,000-pound elephant and I put him on a cable, a piece of metal, a rod, and he just sits there, the concrete won't break. If the elephant starts jumping up and down on that rod, up and down, it will break the concrete. Well, that's what's happening with the cells. And Dr. Paul, as you mentioned, looked at that and said, what are the mechanics and the breakdown of the cell? And what he found is when that on, off kept on hitting the membrane, it weakened the membrane. And that's what allowed the calcium the calcium channel to penetrate. And then there were a bunch of mechanical things that occurred, mechanical things. And that ultimately mutates or precancerous cells. It's because of that breakdown. So it's very different from an ionized signal. An ionized, like you get hit, the cell's gone, and you're in trouble. And it happens almost instantly. But with non-ionized, it takes time. It's that constant load against the cell that can impact it. Matt, what's really important to note, though, and this is more the issue, in my opinion, it's not the cell and the mechanical breakdown of the cell that's more important to us, or the most important thing. And the reason why is we know if you use a cell phone heavily for 10 years, you're 3 times more likely to get frontal lobe cancer. We know that. We know if you're within 1,000 feet of a cell tower, you're 3 times more likely to get cancer. And so there are a lot of these studies that science has done that shows us that it can be serious. But it's not like 20% of us are going to die of frontal lobe cancer. It's the 20% we were talking about before that are getting headaches, depression, they're sleeping problems. They can't quite remember stuff. That's electromagnetic radiation influencing the body, and that's growing. And it's because the ambient in our environment and the use of technology around us is exposing us more and more to these emissions. And they're more long-lasting emissions. They're not like you go to the backwoods at the end of the night and you're safe. Most of us stay within our environment, and it does take a toll on the human body.
So with the electro hypersensitivity people, like we were talking before we started recording about minerals and iron
Oh,
and the antenna
yeah.
aspect, which I'm fascinated with, like mineral balance. And I think like with iron fortification after World War II that started and putting like metal filings in our Cheerios and stuff like that
Oh,
had a
yeah.
huge effect on our health.
Yeah, and actually, we were talking about the carriers they use in vaccinations. I mean, there's aluminum, there's all sorts of stuff they're using to carry the active ingredient. And so there is more kinds of mineral buildup because of the last 50 years, but it's more of an imbalance potential. It's like spinach. You'd get 100 milligrams of iron in spinach 50 years ago. You get 10 today. So the foods we're eating doesn't quite have the sources that we've had in the past. And then the environment itself is creating, for whatever reasons, vaccinations, whatever, problems. And what happens for the electrohypersensitive anyway, it appears when you go in cell danger response, like we talked about, the fight or flight, those metals concentrate in the center of your chest, believe it or not. And all of a sudden, they're not being flushed out by the system under its normal circle, normally how they flush this out. And so there's an excess mineral content, and more oftentimes than not, it's an imbalance. Copper zinc ratios, for example, are really fairly important for the body, and they typically are imbalanced with electrohypersensitive. So to start with, you're already more potentially negatively responding to your environment, to your neighbor, because of those imbalances of the metals. But it doesn't stop there, Matt. We do know that I have a friend of mine, Dr. Porter. You may know him. He has a brain tap, and I talk about the supervisory function of the body, which is the brain, of course. It's the headquarters for the operation of the body. And what we're found is, with all this ambient in the environment and with the transmission devices very close to our body, and particularly our head, you have wave patterns that are in your head when you're walking during the day that are sleep patterns for night. It's disrupting the patterns of the body, the brain patterns of the body. And if you have these kinds of exposures, you sort of have to first begin stabilizing the brain pattern before you can sort of fix anything else, brainstem included, by the way. And then you have the minerals we just talked about, and then we have the gut. When you have a electromagnetic radiation signal and it's close to your body, your immune system's being suppressed. Believe it or not, Dr. Ollie Johansson has done a lot of work for this. He's out of Sweden, and it suppresses our own immune system. And all of a sudden, the gut becomes even more important than before. And what we've seen is bacteria. Some bacteria love electromagnetic radiation. They propagate in front of electromagnetic radiation. Deb C is one example of a bacterium that we know can be elevated. And by the way, those elevations can be deadly. And we're seeing that difference in the gut more than in the past. And we're seeing certain patterns of some of that bacteria influencing, it robs the body of oxygen, that bacterium. So where you're looking to get that energy, it's not there because the bacterium is robbing other things other than it needs to propagate. So it's really fairly complicated stuff that's going on with this kind of stuff. But it really is real. And science actually is beginning to understand fairly well what these kinds of things potentially can be for you, the user of this technology.
Geez, there's so many effects. I was blown away when I learned about the saliva pH change by EMFs. It's like the most foundational stuff. And like
Right.
everyone's having issues and
Right.
digestion
But
issues.
it's funny. We're talking about simplicity. Eat right. Right? Move stuff away from you. Reduce the impact of the stuff by simply turning it off or moving it away from you. There are things we can do, and we are more resilient as a result of those changes we make.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Yeah, and we'll definitely move into solutions after the doom and gloom.
Right.
And I'm glad you brought up the brain waves because there's is it called a carrier signal? I don't know if my terminology is correct, but it's like the 60 hertz that rides on these waves. And I like to think about the brain waves like delta, theta, alpha, beta. It's like a speed, like a
Right. Yeah.
speed
Right.
pedal.
Exactly.
And 60 hertz is like way higher than like beta goes up to 40, I believe. And then we're going to like gamma and epsilon. but 60 is like way up there, right?
Yeah. Well, I know this is not what you intended to discuss, but when you mentioned 60 hertz alternating current, the power from our homes are run at 60 hertz. It's alternating current at 60 hertz. And if you were a welder for your career, or you were an electrician that worked on power panels your whole career, that 60 hertz is influencing your body. And by the time you're 75, you're twice as likely to have Alzheimer's because of those exposures when you were young, if they were heavy. So we really do know it's not just the RF that you got to manage around your environment, but it's also the light bulbs in your house and how you have them distributed in your house.
Mm, that's a good point. Yeah, I have a friend that wrote a cool article on like different brands of bulbs, like
Yes,
Sylvana, and because there's this meme going around that LEDs are bad, and then and incandescents are good. And I found out that's false through him because the flicker rate, some LEDs
right.
are better than
Yeah,
incandescent.
because there's less flicker. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's really true. Um, now that you brought up LEDs, um, when you have a monitor on your that you're literally looking at right now, or the monitor, the screen on your cell phone, um, all these devices, your TV, they all generate visible electromagnetic radiation. Um, Green, yellow, all the rainbow colors are what are considered visible light. Then, as you get on the high side of that, which goes towards ionized radiation, by the way, you get to the blue and ultraviolet. That's at the end of the spectrum. Uh, as you know, ultraviolet light can potentially cause cancer of the skin, and that's because the power levels of that um, emanating radiating signal has enough power to mutate the cell. But blue light coming off your screen is a high intensity blue. And I'll tell it by example. I was talking with a physician at a clinic, and he was telling me how this person in his clinic had dry eye. And I asked him, well, what's the source, do you know? And he said, well, we're not really sure, but we did drops, and it seemed to be working over the last several years to keep it in check. And I said, what does she do in the office? And he said, well, she's looking at the screen all day. So I said, okay. I sent them a pair of blue blocking glasses, right? She didn't have them on more than like 15 minutes or so. Her eyes went wet. It was the blue light that was coming from her monitor that was disrupting the performance of the eye, and is known as a condition that occurs, as is premature macular degeneration. The blue component of a monitor can be dangerous. And so the idea of using glasses that can block the blue component of that spectrum is probably a good idea. It is particularly important at night. And we'll talk about this a little later, maybe. I know it may be something we want to chat about, but I believe in sanctuaries, bedroom sanctuaries. And when you're sitting looking at your tablet at night, and that blue light is hitting your eye, it's more than potentially dangerous to those conditions we talked about. There's a little protein, cryptochrome protein in the back of the eye. That's the little switch that goes on and off. It's off when the light's up, when sunlight's out, and it's on when there's no light anymore. That is the natural response for the body to get into its this 24-hour cyclic um, uh, uh, process that occurs for recovery at night and day. Well, when you're looking at that monitor, that krypton switch is not turning on. And the melatonin that you need to sleep is not coming into your body. And so you're disrupting that whole process simply because you're looking at a monitor at night. So if you do, within 2 hours that you intend to sleep, turn it off because it really is impacting. And if you want to use it, use blue light blocking screens.
Mm-hmm.
But it does impact, and as you know, the mitochondrial repair is at night, and you're disrupting all that stuff that goes on. So you need a circadian rhythm, and you don't want to disrupt it too much if you don't have to. And we know this light can.
Those are really awesome points. And yeah, I think one of the most damaging parts of EMFs are the effects on our sleep and
Yeah.
insomnia, waking up in the middle of the night, urinating
Right.
constantly in the middle of the night. And artificial light is like a form of EMF. I think a lot of people don't realize that.
It's,
right?
it's visible light. Visible light is RF. It's a high-end RF. But I was talking with I was on a podcast, and I was talking with a really, really bright lady. And I said, you need a sanctuary at night. You want to get everything out of the room, everything. You want to make sure your Wi-Fi is off, even if it's outside the room, if you can. You want to make sure there's nothing within the room. You want to make sure the walls are clean for the extreme low frequency stuff. And she was telling me how her husband and her put their cell phone on the bed, the side
nightstand.
Yeah, nightstands, right? And so she was really polite when she said, "Oh, thank you so much for letting me know that," right? And she didn't believe a word I was saying. So about 2 weeks later, maybe 3 weeks, she called me up and said, "I can't believe this. I took the cell phones out of my room, and I actually slept all night, and so did my husband." It's not just the RF or the blue light component bothering the eye, but it's the interference of the side of the brain that's actually controlling certain aspects of the brain that were being influenced from the cell phone activated next to the bed that she was sleeping in. So you really want to spend time making sure you have a clean environment because it can and does disrupt the sleeping.
Mm-hmm. Have you met anyone or have you experimented with like the bed canopies? They're like super expensive, like over $1,000 or $2,000, like that go over the bed that protect from all RF. And
yeah, they're actually not too bad. I mean, in the scale of things, like I don't like grounding pads underneath beds because I don't like what they potentially do. They draw the current to you. But those canopies, believe it or not, they're basically a conduit for any electrical energy that's within that room. And so long as you're not creating within that tent, they're not bad because they're not drawing stuff out of you like a grounded pad would do, and they are taking away the energy that could potentially hit you when you're sleeping at night. And when you're in areas where the ambience much higher, like apartment buildings, where there's a lot of congestion, a lot of routers, a lot of sources, some of that stuff maybe makes sense to you. They're expensive, but they're not dangerous, and they do have a protective characteristic, which may help.
that's awesome. Yeah, I'm fascinated by all this stuff because I used to sleep under like a giant pyramid. I used to sleep on magnets and all. I've tried a lot of stuff over the years. So.
Hey, Matt, do you know the cell doesn't know the difference between an electrical signal or a magnetic signal? It doesn't know.
Wow.
So when you were sitting on those magnets, there may be good stuff going on, but there could have been bad stuff going on as well.
Wow. Yeah, I think there's so much to explore with like pulsed electromagnetic field therapy because you were talking about the elephant analogy earlier in the pulse. And I
Right.
think there's like you can overuse PEMF or you could overuse some
Right.
therapies. Right.
But believe it or not, I'm asked all the time from physicians, What do you think of this kind of approach? And I always talk about duration. If it's not going to be for 5 hours, then it's going to be for 5 minutes. I wouldn't worry about it. But if it's 5 hours, I would. And if it's constant all the time, it will take a toll on the cells. We know that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. Well, let's move into some Q&A because we have quite a few questions. And we had a bunch of people asking about Bluetooth headphones. I guess those are
Oh,
trending right now. Like those wireless,
yeah.
are those harmful?
So we talked about the foundational stuff, so we can talk about this now. Some of these devices, these wireless Bluetooth, I'm not saying all, but I know for sure some do. They communicate with each side from one to the other. Bluetooth is 0.3 watts per kilogram, by the way. It's 5 times less power level than a cell phone, but it's 0.3 watts. And we know from science and research work that has been done in the past that you can mutate a cell, a frontal lobe cell, with 0.1 watt, 15 times less the power level. So you have a signal going through the head, which is a microwave signal, and it's 0.3 watts. It's low, but it's a lot of transmitting back and forth. And to me, I think you're taking more of a chance than you need to just to hear a song. There are a lot of other ways of doing it, but I do not think it's wise to use wireless Bluetooth earbuds. I just don't think it's smart.
Even a Bluetooth speaker would be better, right? That's what I use.
Yeah, right. At least it's away from you, and you can hear the music pretty well, and you're probably better off. Right.
Yep, that's good. I get this one a lot too. How to explain to a skeptic the dangers of EMF? What do you say, like Martin Paul's work? I haven't found a good website that like lists like the
I
research.
go to my website,
Awesome.
defendershield.com. I have a learning section and I list everything out there. But let me answer that question for you. There are thousands of studies, literally thousands of studies that have been done that directly link electromagnetic radiation to harmful effects on the human body. Yale a few years ago talked about the thyroid, and it said if you had a mutated gene, which many of us have, and there was fluoride within the tissue, and you had a 2.4 gigahertz router next to you, you were 3 times more likely to get cancer in your thyroid. This was their fact. But even maybe more importantly, when you look at science, you look for statistical significance. And so maybe 10 years ago, Matt, you may have heard about this National Toxicology Program, which is the division of the federal government. They spent about $25 million. And it was an epidemiology study in which there were tens of thousands of subjects that were housed in an environment where there was a constant RF signal, a cell phone signal, and one group that were not. And after the 10-year period and $25 million spent, what they found was there was statistically significant increase in frontal lobe cancer and heart cancer. In other words, the soft tissues of the body seem to have been affected. Now, the reproduction was affected, but not in a cancerous way in the study. That was reinforced by the Ramazani Institute study roughly at the same time. Totally independent, out of Italy, same research groups, experts in their field, and they found identical statistical significance. And so the cells of the subjects are very, very close to the human. And it was statistically significant. And that was clear. And it was federal government driven, by the way, which we talked about before, they don't do. But they were trying to prove there was no impact. But unfortunately for them, they found there was. So you can debate it, and it is debated all the time. But the metadata, if you look at all the study work and you combine similar studies, there's strong evidence that that there is a correlation between some of the body conditions we have with the transmitted signals of a cell phone.
Hmm.
As a side note, and we haven't talked about this, but as a side note, those scientists argued with the FCC in front of the um, it was a Supreme Court uh, appeals panel, and they said that they made a decision about 5G and said there's nothing wrong with the standards as they exist today. And the FCC said that. And the scientist group, actually, Robert Kennedy, I think, was one of them. And they argued that they didn't look at the science because it was so compelling. And believe it or not, the FCC was almost thrown out of the room by the judges because it was clear and evident. FCC did not look at the facts. So there's debate in the courts these days about this very subject.
Wow. Jeez, that's crazy.
Yeah.
um, but this is a good one. What are basic things people can start with that feels very overwhelming? Like unplugging the router at night. Would you say that's a good start?
You know, it's funny. I'm old and I won't remember to pull my router and turn it off, right? So what I do is I have a timer, and like a $10 timer. And I go to bed at 10 o'clock at night, so my router goes off at 10 o'clock at night. I get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, so my router goes on at 5 o'clock in the morning. So I don't have to remember that. But in general, if you can turn it off, turn it off. If you can put it on a timer, put it on a timer. Any of those kinds of activity really do help. If you are have a laptop, a portable laptop, your first inclination may be to use a Wi-Fi connection. But maybe if you can get an Ethernet and connect to the laptop to your router, and you eliminate that RF signal in the room, and you reduce the number of bees in the room. So as a general practice, you should really always wire something if you can before you use the wireless component, all trying to reduce the bees in the room. So there's the ways of removing it or simply moving away. When I come home at night, I take my cell phone, I put it on a little table, and it's far away from where I live. And unfortunately, if it rings, I have to run. But it's never near where I live. So just simply trying to figure out how to minimize that exposure in your own home is a great thing to do as well. If you're going to have a router, it doesn't have to be in the middle of your living room to work. You can put it in your garage. These current routers today can go 2,000 feet. And so if it's in your garage, it's not near your living quarters. It's really much less harmful potentially. So simply by physically putting it places where it's less, particularly where the family's living, is an easy thing to do, and it reduces those exposures. If you use a cell phone, the time you use it is important. The duration that you use it. If you're using it for 5 minutes, you do not have to worry. If you're using it for 5 hours a day, you're a heavy user. And again, we talked about 3 times more likely to get frontal lobe cancer as a result. So simply the duration of exposure, if you control that, rather than talking to mom and for an hour, talk to her for 5 minutes. I only talk to my mom for 5 minutes. I can't stand it after 5 minutes, but just the duration of time that you use technology really does have a big impact on how it affects your body. If you choose to use these devices, you may want to find ways of mitigating that. And there are some manufacturers that offer a shielding that can prevent the signal from passing through. And so long as they have independent laboratory study tests that show that it really does what it says it does, you may want to, for example, have a cell phone case that doesn't allow a signal to go to the head, but allows it to go to the cell tower. But you never really need any of that if you're aware of your environment. It's simple as that.
That's a great point. Yeah, whenever I'm at the store, I'll just put on speaker, and even though everyone around me can hear my conversation, I'll just hold it out here instead
Yeah.
of. I pretty much never hold it to my head, and I think if you don't mind speaker, that's an option too. I mean, your hand's getting hit, but
Yeah, actually, no one's ever died of cancer of a hand from RF signals. So it's a very good thing to do. But you also, there are earbuds you can get that convert the electrical signal to an acoustical connection to the ear, which I'm using right now. And you eliminate the electrical current flow that goes towards the head by using them. So if you don't want to use something so everyone in the grocery store knows what you're buying, you can use earbuds that may help you.
That's awesome. It's a great point. Let's see. Just had a lot of questions about best EMF protection living in a city, and most of my family and friends are in Southern California, and they're just getting. I mean, every time I go there I'm in North Idaho, and I go down to California, I just feel so stressed. I mean, after 4 days, I'm just like super irritable, kind of like fatigued, brain
Right.
fog, and that's even with EMF protection clothing. I can't imagine without it. But would you say the silver embedded clothing, the t-shirts, the baseball cap, just like physically
Yes.
blocking is a good.
Yeah. Those are grounded. They're floating grounds, and so when there is a ambient signal in your area, it will hit that, and believe it or not, the energy will run through that, but it loses its power level as it's doing it. And by the time it gets to the other side of whatever device you have, it doesn't exist anymore. So they do actually work. And so I always recommend for people who find themselves in a metropolitan area that and a home within that multi-family complex, do the best they can by mitigating that which they control. Make sure they do turn the router off. Make sure they do turn they have the Roku connected with the Ethernet. Make sure their laptops are connected with an Ethernet. Do as much as you can to reduce it in that environment. And because distance is your friend, it does help.
That's a good point. How to test your home for EMFs? I have like a magnetic, an RF, an electric meter, and the RF one's cool. It has like the big antenna, the green
Yeah,
antenna on top. You've probably seen it,
I
and that
do.
you could hear it. It's kind of fun
Yeah,
to use.
yeah. Actually, the one you're describing is fairly expensive,
Yeah.
and they're actually pretty accurate.
Mm.
Um, and, and and I'm often asked, should I go buy a meter? Most of the meters that are available, they can be orders of magnitude inaccurate. So it's just an indication of what potentially may exist in your environment. The kind of meter you have is more expensive and more accurate. But the reality of it is, Matt, what you really should spend your time is not on spending a lot of money, but thinking about where the bees are in the room. And it's not a mystery. By reducing what you can, you're doing the most you can with or without a meter. And so I always suggest first spend the time making sure you've cleaned up your own environment. And don't worry about your neighbor's environment because there's nothing you can do about it. And there's a distance which keeps it a bit more safe. But definitely make sure you clean your own environment.
It's a great point. Yeah. Uh, Ways to mitigate EMF while riding in a car. I used to ground my car. Have you ever heard of that or done that? Like put the little
No.
rubber strip under the car. I always got people asking, "You got something hanging from your car?" I'm like, I know. It got so annoying, I took it off.
Yeah, right. I'm not sure how effective that was, Matt, but a good idea. Yeah, that's one of those things with a car. It's almost the same thing, by the way. Reduce the number of bees within that room. It's like if I have a cell phone, I never put it next to me. I always put it on the other side of the car. I don't have Wi-Fi on. I don't have Bluetooth on. And so I'm minimizing as much as I can by the sources I bring in. And if you can, don't use electric motors much inside. Stuff where there's sources. A lot of stuff today you can't control very much, particularly modern cars. They transmit Bluetooth, but by and large, they're fairly safe. And even the screens of the new cars. If you have an electrical car, you have more emissions coming off that screen than you do from the electrical motors. Believe it or not. There's where the more of the dangers are, is in that thing, not in the wheel wells that have the motors in it, not where the batteries are. They're fairly safe, but in general, there's not much you can do in a car. It is a Faraday cage, and when you put your cell phone in there and you want to talk, it's going to modulate up to the highest signal to get out of the car. So when you tell your doctor, I have a problem because it modulates up when I'm using it, the doctor says, don't use it. And you reduce the exposure as a result.
So what do you think of electric cars? Because like Tesla's trending. I bought the Nissan Leaf like in 2011, and it was funny. It was like a 30-mile one-way range. It was horrible.
You're right. Actually, Matt, they're not bad. The coils, the area where there is most concern is in the coil. Those coils are at the wheel well, and there's a couple of feet between you and that typically, and so it's fairly safe. Believe it or not, you take your meter out there, and you'll see it's fairly safe. So I don't fret about them and those environments being worse than a gas engine motor car, and they're about the same. You have electrical motors in a regular car that are more dangerous than the coils in your wheel well.
That's interesting. Wow. Yeah, I drive a truck now because I need it to
Yeah,
carry
right,
hay
exactly.
bales and stuff.
Yeah. When you kill your big moose, you got to bring it back home.
Right. We didn't talk about, I think we touched on 5G a little bit, but that's like a big buzzword and probably a whole episode in itself. But I think there's a lot of fear about, 5G blanketing the earth, and Elon
Okay.
Musk. I signed up for Starlink and people were freaked out about all that stuff.
Yeah. Let's try to talk about that a little bit. It's fairly difficult subject matter, but almost everything that's been deployed that's called 5G by all the service providers are all below 10 gigahertz. They're typically 2.4 gigahertz. They're 600 megahertz. They're in the range that has existed for the last 30 years. So there's not much change in terms of, is it dangerous or not? It's the same danger as 4G and below. So most of everything deployed is relatively safe compared to some other aspects of it. The big deal is when it gets above 10 gigahertz. And the real controversy is when they start deploying technology in the small cell site. The small cell site is where there's an antenna in front of your home, and it's transmitting into your house, and it goes about 750 feet. They are at typically 23 gigahertz up to 90 gigahertz or so. And I should have mentioned this before. A hertz, if you take a post, you put it in the ground in the sea, and you watch the waves go by. If you see one wave go by in 1 second, it's 1 hertz. If you see a billion waves go by in 1 second, it's a gigahertz. When you say I saw 23 billion waves go by, that's 23 gigahertz. So it's going really, really, really fast. And the real controversy lies there. The question is, what happens to the human nature, for that matter, when there's a 23 gigahertz transmitted signal so close to the body? And Matt, no one knows. There has been no study, no research, no understanding of those speeds in any environment. So we really don't know. Characteristics of those very high speeds are other things that are occurring. Rather than sending one on off beam, there are actually two being sent. And it's focused on the device that it's feeding, and that's known as MIMO, multi in, multi out. So there's multiple signals going in and out. That's never been done before in the environment. And we've talked about power levels, right? A cell phone is 1.6 watts. A cell tower is roughly 60 watts, and it's about 5 miles away, 4 or 5 miles away. And so a 4G signal can go really far with 60 watts. Well, the signals we're talking about on small cell sites can only go 750 feet. But to get there at 750 feet, they're somewhere between 40 and 90 to 100 watts. So it's a lot of power in front of your home. That's where the controversy is. That's where the big deal is. No one really knows yet. And the controversy really lies in that area, not necessarily the lower rates. And honestly, no researcher, no scientist, no anybody can tell you that it is dangerous, because we don't have scientific study to prove that. If you ask me to extrapolate from what we know today and say, where is it going tomorrow at these higher rates? I would say there's a probability that it's worse. But without science, we don't know.
Wow, that's fascinating stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of anecdotal stuff. Like, I think I've said the story before on my show, but I was going to get burger and fries with my brother, and he was driving us on the freeway in Southern California to the burger joint, and I started to feel really sick and like irritable, and I got quiet and I started sweating, and I got really red. And we got back home, and I was like, what happened to me? And I looked just on the freeway, where the I-5 we were driving on, and I think it was the Verizon or AT&T map, and they put them along the freeway, and it was the
Right.
exact route that we were on for about 20 minutes driving.
Right.
And like, no wonder I didn't have any of my protection on or anything.
Yeah, no, based on the few things I've heard, there's no doubt you're electric hypersensitive. And what you were feeling on those transports in California, they're all building out the cell towers, the 5G cell towers. They're the lowest speeds, but there are more of them in that environment, and and you're feeling it. I had a physician that gave me a buzz one day on a Saturday, and he said, my head is killing me. I can't stand what's going on. Something's happening. And I said, did you get a new service? And he said, yeah, I did. I got a new cable service. And I said, did you get a coaxial cable service of some sort? Did you get a fiber optic cable service? No. It's all wireless. I said, go look at the router. And he turned the router upside down that said 5G. And there's an example of a small cell site transmitting to a device, which was the router, at 23 gigahertz. And I said, turn the thing off and see what happens. And of course, within an hour, headaches went away and blah, blah, blah. So there is a penetration of those technologies. And for the electric hypersensitive, they'll feel it more than most of us, other of us will. But it is very real, and it is very concerning, because it's almost like the canary in the coal mine. You're sort of feeling something, and it's not necessarily good, and most clinics don't accept it as a diagnostic, or they can't diagnose it because they don't know the biomarkers to do that.
Right. Yeah, it's a good point. So the cell tower that like the stereotypical with like the vertical posts they often hide in like palm trees. Is
Yeah,
that a 5G tower or 4G
it
or
could
could
be.
be either?
Yeah,
Okay.
anything that's like below 100 feet,
Mhm.
it's the stuff that's on a telephone pole.
Mhm.
That is not a standard typical 4G or even new 5G. It's really a small cell site. And you see that more often in metropolitan areas. When service is being demanded for in a metropolitan area, it costs a lot of money to run the cables to provide that service. So what they're doing they're using these small cell sites to provide the service. And that actually is starting to happen. So when you go to the cities that you visit and you see a tower that's on a telephone pole, it's a 23 gigahertz signal probably transmitting from it.
Wow. Yeah, supposedly, I don't know if you've looked into Nikola Tesla. I think they just came out with a new movie like based on his story and supposedly he was trying to transmit wireless
Yeah.
energy in a healthy way.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. He was. He
Mhm.
actually thought he could run a motor, electrical motor, wirelessly. Um, Never succeeded ultimately, but that was certainly his plan. He wanted to get rid of the cable plant, which was the most costly part of providing the service. It just never happened, though, unfortunately, or
Mhm.
fortunately.
Right.
I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah, it's
sure.
such an interest it's hard to know what actually happened because I've heard
Right, it
many
is.
things.
It is. Yeah, I was from New Jersey, and supposedly they had one of those sites up there. So
Well,
I never saw it. So
yeah, is it Wardenclyffe, I think it was.
yeah, yeah,
Right.
that's where it
Yeah.
was. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Oh, this is actually, well, just ask you a few more if you're still good on time. Since I'm getting on full solar, and they're not on the roof, fortunately, they're on panels or they're on mounts away from the house, which is hopefully good. And I'm going to put in like a whole house dirty electricity inline filter. But we had a question on how are solar panels for EMFs? Because I've heard if you have them on the roof, they can emit a pretty strong, is it electric field or?
yeah. Anytime there's current flow,
Mhm.
anytime power is going through a cable, you have electromagnetic radiation. If it's alternating current, it's called extreme low frequency emissions, and typically at 60 hertz. Um, when it's DC, all it means is it's not oscillating.
Hmm.
So you still have emissions, and the solar panels themselves are generating the energy, and it's being brought to a source for storage. And so there is current flow and there is emissions, and it's DC emissions. And that can be dangerous because remember, I told you there's no difference. The cell doesn't know the difference between electrical and or magnetic. So you're right. If you can do it, you really do want to try to keep it off the roof. But if it's on the roof and you have an attic that no one's living in, I'm not sure that is that a big deal, right?
That's a good point. Yeah, and I think that I'm still learning about it. It's fascinating to learn about all the different, but I think the inverter converts it from AC to DC.
Yeah, but
So,
that's where a conversion is occurring, but it's typically in the basement or something,
mhm,
and so it's probably fairly safe for the conversions to occur.
mhm. Um, what are some weird symptoms you've heard about caused by EMFs? I'm sure you have all sorts of stories.
Well, there's ringing of the ears, the tendonitis, right? All of a sudden, everyone has it, and everyone's wondering what it is. But that's typically identified as electromagnetic radiation kind of response. But the stuff that we're only beginning to learn is the neurological and physiological changes. I mean, when I said before about the classroom, I'm pretty concerned about that because there is clearly an uptake in the classroom where there's the presence of RF, and there is a rise. It seems accordingly to the level of deployment of these technologies and the anxiety, the depression. All of these are frontal lobe things, and we know our bodies are susceptible to that. And so, but to talk about, like worst case, there was a guy I knew that was an electrician in a corporation, and he worried about large panels, AC panels. When he got so sick that finally he stopped working, and they really didn't know the source of it until they went to this clinic, and the clinic lead happened to be electric hypersensitive himself. He went into the clinic on a wheelchair. So the debilitation of his body got worse and worse and worse to where he became pretty dysfunctional, to the point where he couldn't even walk. He didn't have balance. Um, and um, and this particular clinic, they went after the mind. They balanced out the brainwaves first. They found weaknesses in the brainstem. They found dysfunction in the brainstem, and they went into the gut. They went into the eating habits, looking for the right foodstuffs. It took probably over a year for the guy to be what they refer to as resilient. And it was, in their view, caused by the occupation and what he did in that occupation. So it got pretty severe. And believe it or not, before I fully understood this, I used to talk with another lady up in New York, and she was multiply chemically sensitive, without a doubt. And she was telling me how, she felt really, really bad when she went near certain stuff. And it was clear that she had the problem of, can I get out of my own home? Because I really do feel like I'm being attacked when I go out. So it can get pretty serious psychologically as well as physically. So, but the worst I saw was the guy was in a wheelchair, and it took him over a year to get better.
Wow. That's really fascinating about the brain waves, because I played with neurofeedback, like dynamic neurofeedback.
Oh yeah, I'm telling you, it's real. And Matt, you can actually measure the frontal lobe and how it's, I'm angry today. Well, there are parts of the body where the anger occurs in the frontal lobe, and so you can really look for the conductivity within the frontal lobe for performance, and you can physically see change once you adjust those patterns for good or bad. And the medical community is only beginning to understand sort of the correlation between how they get that done effectively using certain patternistic protocol to get it done.
Wow. Yeah, the tinnitus thing was fascinating too, because I have a mineral expert I interview on the show often, Morley Robbins, and he was saying he doesn't. When I asked him a long time ago, he said it's probably a magnesium deficiency, the tinnitus, and my dad actually got it after shooting at a range, and I think he wasn't wearing his headphones for a second or something, and just the gunshots. But the kicker is my dad is a computer guy, tech guy. He's worked in the computer industry for decades, like 30, 40 years.
So he's been exposed, right? Wow.
So that set off alarm bells. So the tinnitus was probably, it's probably a combination of the shooting range.
It is. It's a part of the brain that's fairly exterior. So, and the magnesium I've heard before, by the way.
Because I think that's drained with EMFs, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure we know that clearly, but there's clear evidence of some of that happening. I'm not sure we fully understand it yet. But but with the magnesium, like I know there's problems with the not magnesium, copper zinc ratios in parts of the body, that when it's off, there are certain body responses that occur as a result of that, and it's driven by electromagnetic radiation. When you have we mentioned, when you have a cell phone to your head, you have a debilitation of the immune system. What I didn't say is the blood-brain barrier is suppressed as well. So
Mm.
it's easier for the signals to get through because the blood-brain barrier supposedly protects stuff from getting in and out, mostly chemicals, but electromagnetic radiation. So a lot of patients have concussion-like symptoms because when you concuss, you have a blood-brain barrier problem.
Wow. Yeah, the classroom stuff is fascinating to me because I took like a teaching careers class in high school, and I worked with fourth graders for a while, and then I worked with juvenile hall kids for 4 years later on, and I just saw like the attention issues, the
Yeah,
just the misbehaving, like
yeah,
just the brain fog. There's no
right.
one home. Just their
Yeah.
eyes are fine. I was like,
No, it's really true. And you got to remember, 0.5 watts doesn't look like a lot of power, but it's a lot of power for 8 hours a day.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden you start correlating some of these tracks of things that are occurring with kids. And I personally think they directly correlate. Research shows it does, but it's not statistically significant enough to
Mhm.
draw the final conclusion about. But we know, there's a lot of research that shows that those links. Um, so yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, do you want to talk about Defender Shield for a minute? The company, some more solutions or,
Well,
uh,
it's funny. I mentioned that my wife wanted grandchildren, right? And so I even when I was in the Bell system doing electrical stuff, I was a mechanical engineer by trade. So I knew what the problem was, and so I said, "Well, I know what I can do mechanically." So because I took metallurgy, and so uh, I actually created several shielding materials that I actually put into a prototype product, and it worked. And so then my son's friends wanted uh, a product. Well, we weren't producing it, so I made some prototypes for them, and more we got being asked for it. So we started Defender Shield, and we started building shielding devices, Defender pads for um, for friends and family, and that technology could be applied anywhere. And I remember I was listening. I read an article where a 16-year-old girl wanted a cell phone, and um, perfectly healthy young lady. She got a cell phone, and with 1 year, she had frontal lobe cancer and passed away. And they kept on blaming the cell phone. And I said to myself, I know I can stop the signal. And if it was true, it was the cell phone that created the cancer. I know I can stop it. So we started doing cell phones, and then that led to blankets. Because if if you're in the first trimester of your pregnancy, and you're exposed to a high level of RF, you're 3 times more likely to have a miscarriage than the average population. So protecting the womb was sort of an important thing for us to do. And so I created blankets and other devices to protect the womb of a woman. And and the blanket is a floating ground, which I actually believe in. I believe in floating grounds. I don't believe in grounds. And not too much or too little is taken away. And so we have those. Earbuds. We had people who even the slightest electrical signal from earbuds bothered people. So I said, okay, I'll take it out. And I convert the signal, and then I go acoustical, and things work fine. And so we have a whole line of ear devices, overheads, earbuds, and so we go on and on. But honestly, Matt, the stuff we also pay a lot of attention to is what's going on in the medical field, what's going on in the industry, and we spend a lot of time trying to keep everyone up to date on what it is and what's not. Don't panic. There's a lot of things you can do, and if you want to sort of get a sense of linkages or things you need to do, go to the website and we have practical ways of dealing with your environment, and we give you an understanding of what the science is saying and what the science is learning. And of course, Radiation Nation, the book I wrote with my son because I was so frustrated that Dr. Paul's work, Dr. Ali Johansson's work, all these guys were doing really great work, but none of us knew. And so I said, well, let's try to gather a little bit of information so people can make intelligent decisions. And that was the origins of Radiation Nation. And by the way, when you're shielding these technologies, if you go to the dentist and you get an X-ray, there's a piece of lead they put on top of you. It looks like a blanket, but it's a bunch of lead. It's so when they zap and take the picture that they don't die in the other room and you don't die because of the lead that they have on top of you, right? Well, that lead does not stop electromagnetic radiation. It does ionized radiation at the gamma ray levels, but not the terahertz level, but not those of the RF. Well, when we went to the 5G, I'm most concerned about the 23 gigahertz and above, right? So we've been in development for over 2.5, 3 years, and we actually developed shielding that can stop a 23 gigahertz signal. And it's now in many of our products, so you're really 5G protected. But I now can put it on your wall. I can now actually shield between your family and the antenna outside in front of your home with a 5G shield that prevents the signals from coming in. And I'm just so excited about that because of my concern about where these signals are going to go and how they're going to impact the body and the family in general. So
Just like a paint or?
no, it's a wallpaper. We actually
Oh,
have it so it looks like a piece of wallpaper that you can paint, by the way. And by the way, it's from secure rooms in the military space. We were trying to use the technologies that we could adopt, and that's what we have. So we literally are going to have very shortly stuff you can put on a wall that shields your room. And I don't believe in Faraday cages with their home because I don't like the stuff you generate inside. But if I put it between you and the wall, you and the device, the antenna on the outside, you're pretty protected. And we talk about that as ultra armor. But and all of this is to continue trying to protect as many people as we can.
that is really exciting. So the idea is not to surround you in it, but just
Right,
to put it on the wall between you and the
right.
tower or you and the router.
Yeah, remember I told you it's directional, right?
Mhm.
So we can prevent that direction from coming into the house. And you got to be very careful you don't put it all the way around.
Mhm.
Some think it's a good idea. It's not a good idea because you know how you felt disrupted. Well, if you seal your whole house and you have a little bit of bees in the room, just a few, you're in trouble because it's not going anywhere.
Wow, that's interesting. Okay. So if you are to create like a little Faraday room, like never bring your phone in or anything, it'd
Right,
probably be better to make it like a small meditation
right.
room or something.
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, you got to be careful. A bedroom, maybe, but you got to be very diligent at taking sources out of the room. Um,
Mhm.
and um, and if you're diligent, you're safe.
Mhm.
Again, you don't need anything I build. If you know your environment, you're the architect of your own destiny. It's you who have to decide how you reduce the exposures. And if you're diligent about it, you can be pretty comfortable. You're safe.
That's awesome. Yeah, and my favorite products from you are really I love all of them, but the beanie and the baseball cap
Yeah.
because like all this talk about the frontal lobe, right? It's like
Yeah.
you don't have to. I mean, you could wear aluminum foil, right? I mean, that would kind of work to line
It,
your hat with it, but
believe it or not, it does because it's a conduit for the energy level. It's not quite as good as what we do, but it literally works. And for most people, maybe enough. but I don't know how I'd look walking around with aluminum on my head. And I was really worried about the frontal lobe. I honestly was really worried about it. And in my opinion, that exposure, even to the ambient, for some is too much. That's why we had the cap. We customize a cap uniquely for us that makes sure it's a high grade shielding characteristics that does protect the frontal lobe. And yeah, we're happy we got that and made it available.
Yeah, and you helped expand my understanding in this chat about the floating ground, because I was kind of confused. Like, I heard some fear porn floating around. It's like, oh, it bounces around. Like if you're wearing a cap, it comes in below and then bounces all around. But you're saying it absorbs it and then
It's a conduit.
Right.
It's a conduit. That's what it is. Most of this stuff is silver. Silver is better than copper. It's a conduit. And that's all you're trying to do, divert the signal. And these energies are not really high energies. And so these metals are more than adequate in providing that protection.
That's awesome. And last question for you about your products. Like, I might get the holster, but usually I just turn off. I mean, I always have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth off, but I put it on airplane mode. I turn off location services if I'm
Yeah,
going in Costco or something, and I'll put my phone in my pocket on airplane mode
right.
with the location services off. But um, with your products, like, you could keep your phone on and put it in
Yeah,
the pouch, and it's
right.
fine. You just can't
Yeah,
receive a call or.
right. Yeah, actually, in some pouches we have, it will ring. But
Oh,
yeah, our goal was for those who don't want to go through and turn it on and off, put it in the thing and it'll still work, but nothing's passing through to your body. And some people like that. And so we created because we were asked to create these kinds of things. We've had a very interactive customer base, unfortunately.
That's cool. Yeah, because I thought I've heard before. I mean, there's all these myths. It could be a myth, but that like, if it has to struggle to find a signal, like if you're trying to shield it, then it'll increase the emission. Have you heard that kind of idea?
Yeah. Okay. Think of it this way. When you're really close to a cell tower, the modulated signal is low. If you are trying to meet the cell tower that's a mile away, it has to modulate up to a mid-range level. If it's 5 miles away, it has to modulate up to a highest level of 1.6 watts. So it modulates based on the difficulty of getting to the end source. So there are some technologies that are deployed that disrupt the cell phone's ability to determine how far it goes, and it modulates as high as it can. In our case, we don't absorb, we don't interfere with the signal. It does whatever it wants. We just stop it. And we're not drawing more or less than need to for it to operate. Even if it did, you're still shielded. Right. So I mean, I don't understand the problem. Right. People don't understand the physics of it.
Hmm. So which ones allow a call? Was it the holster or you
All
have
of
like
them,
a
all
fanny
of them
pack?
do. We
Oh, wow.
designed all of them to do that.
Oh,
So you don't
cool.
miss a call, but you're protected. And it's not modulating higher or lower because there's interference. Yeah, we use fairly sophisticated shielding technologies.
That's really cool. Yeah, and I think the iPad or tablet protection is huge, because most
Yes.
people put that right on their lap, right, and just
Oh, no
browse.
question about it. And we actually have several shields in there because we're concerned about back and front and everywhere. So yeah, we really tried to keep. And believe it or not, I was more concerned with kids than you. You know what I mean? It's like our kids are using the stuff at younger and younger ages, and they really do need to try to have some protection when they do.
Yeah, and the gloves are really cool too. I kind of want to just get
Yeah,
everything.
yeah, yeah. We're able to help the electric hypersensitive, and we can do everything we can to do it, but yet their hands still tingle when they on a keyboard or they have other things they do, and they need it. And so I sort of reluctantly did it, but I knew what to do. And we have these gloves that, believe it or not, people really want. And of course, they really work. So for those who, particularly those who are hypersensitive, that tingling goes away essentially.
That'd be awesome. Oh, I'd be fully protected with a speaker then, because my
Right,
hand still
yeah,
gets
exactly.
tired. I feel like my hand kind of cramps up doing the speaker.
Actually, it's interacting with the muscles, right? Parlor tricks and all that, right? So yeah, there really is. But what you need to know is, no one's ever died of cancer of the hand. It's just more resilient. The body's more able to deal with it.
And I use a selfie stick if I'm FaceTiming my family or something. That kind of helps. Yeah.
No, that's the distance part. That simple little distance part really means a lot for some of us.
Yep. Well, awesome. Well, Daniel, this was really informative, and I'll link your website, and the scientific studies tab is really, really useful. And I have a little discount code for followers. I'll post in the notes. And
good.
Yeah, just thanks for coming on and sharing your wisdom. This was really fun.
Hey, Matt, thanks an awful lot. I love it when I chat with people who want to understand, because we can talk all night about this stuff, and we help people understand it and not like go nuts about it. You shouldn't go nuts about it. You control your environment, and there's a lot we can do, and a lot we can do to make our families safe. So, Matt, thanks an awful lot for inviting me. I really did enjoy the time.
Right on. Thanks, Daniel. We'll stick around while I close out the show. Thanks so much.
Okay.
Well, that's all for today's show. I learned a lot from that. I was fascinated by the point that RF is looking to ground. I've never thought about it that way. And that the body acts like a capacitor, absorbing the stuff around it, simply put. And I just like Daniel's practical, grounded, pun intended, approach to EMFs and EMF mitigation, and the whole concept of the floating ground, meaning like his Defender Shield technology, which is silver embedded, but a little more complicated with the material that they use. And I feel such a difference whenever I wear their baseball cap that has the silver lining on the inside. I think that's a real practical way to defend yourself if you're going into a really crowded area, especially like an airport or a Starbucks or a shopping mall, where people are just densely packed together and there's all these businesses around, or apartment complexes, or if you're driving and you're being exposed to just tons of signals, especially on the freeway, because as I mentioned to Daniel, that's where they're targeting now. And I felt it when I was visiting California. It was a really intense effect that messed me up for actually a few hours. It took me a few hours to recover from that assault, just getting hit on the freeway as a passenger from the cell towers. So the whole electro hypersensitivity thing that Daniel mentioned, 20% of people, 80% of which is women, fascinates me. And I believe that number is going to climb. And I wonder what factors play into that. I would imagine the retinol and the copper coming into the mother before she has the child affects the electro-hypersensitivity of the child. So, before a woman has a child, my top supplementation that I always recommend is desiccated beef liver, desiccated oysters, whole food vitamin C, vitamin K2, vitamin E, and then some magnesium, and maybe some low-dose Shilajit, especially if she's been on Shilajit for a while, so there's not that heavy metal detox effect if the mother has been on it for a while before conception. They're really covered. And then just animal nutrition, eggs, cheese, milk, red meat, all of the good stuff, potatoes, fruit, honey, maple syrup, all the good stuff. Then that will actually fortify the child. And I believe that there's less risk of the child being electro-hypersensitive. And of course, the environment that the mother is in, I'm sure plays a role. So just mitigating, like Daniel said, turning off your Wi-Fi router at night. And I really loved his timer idea. I thought that was genius. I've never thought about that. I always use the remote that you can just plug the router into, and then you just keep the remote by the bed and you just click off. But his idea is even easier, where if you have a schedule, as you should, of going to bed on time, then it just switches off when you know that you're not going to be using Wi-Fi, and you don't even have to worry about it. You don't even have to think about it. And that's really what health is about. And to me, homesteading is working smart, not hard, and making as much as you can automated in a safe way. Because there's definitely like smart devices, as we mentioned, which you don't want to go that route, but there's a way to do it smart without blasting yourself with EMFs. I definitely recommend looking into Martin Paul's work. I'm trying to get him to get on the podcast at some point, because I think he's really great the way that he breaks down scientifically the way that EMFs affect the body and the calcium ion channels opening, but also iron flooding in and that causing extreme oxidative stress. So there's this like domino cascade of effects that happens when we are exposing our body, as Daniel said, the capacitor, to these RF, these radio frequency fields, where it causes increased cell permeability and all these issues that people are dealing with: leaky gut, indigestion, insomnia, depression, especially the neurodegenerative diseases. This really is a root cause thing. It's really not all about food. And all of these food first people that are just emphasizing, the raw primal diet or the carnivore diet or whatever diet, it's not about the diet. It's about actually looking at holistically everything in your life, even your relationships, everything, and taking an inventory of your weakest link and finding out what that is. Maybe you're working too much. Maybe you're not working enough. Maybe you're not working towards where you want to be, and that can cause depression. So there's little things that you could work on, or you could work on all of it at once, which is what I do, what I've done over the years. And just mitigating this one piece of the electromagnetic fields, just putting that baseball cap on, just, shielding your torso from EMFs when you're driving, when you're at the airport, when you're flying, when you're in a population dense city, if you live in an apartment, if you live, where there's a lot of people, or you travel a lot, the body is really getting hit hard, and the damage is cumulative. And I think it's that cumulative damage that people tend to overlook, because it's death by 1,000 cuts. It's not just, one day you get slammed all at once. It's a constant barrage assault on the body. So mitigation techniques that I focus on is magnesium shilajit, which helps to fortify the system at the mineral level, and then getting in the whole food vitamin C, the ruminant animal liver, like the beef liver, the oysters. So you get that bioavailable copper from those three things, the whole food vitamin C, and that helps to stabilize your system at an energetic level because it acts on the respiratory enzymes. All of the oxidase enzymes are all copper dependent. So if you plug the mineral piece in, which from what I've seen, everyone is mineral deficient, then you're able to fortify the system. And I believe that grounding works better if you're barefoot in the grass or at the beach or in the forest. I believe that the effect is more beneficial if your body has mineral balance. So check out Defender Shield. I'll put the link below, and you actually save a little bit of money if you use my discount code, which is MITO10, MITO10, and you save 10% on any of their products. I love all of them, especially their phone one. I use their little phone mount for my car and the little magnetic phone case that they sell. I love their beanie and their baseball cap and their blanket. Pretty much all their stuff is awesome. And if you've ever felt your hands burning, like I have when you hold your phone for a long time, then the protection gloves for $30, I think, are a really great investment. If for whatever reason you have to hold your phone, I think that's a great defense. But I thought it was funny when Daniel said no one's ever died from, getting cancer in their hand or whatever. So it's still affecting your cells and still affecting your bloodstream. And so I think the gloves are still a smart idea. And they even have the air tube headphones, because I know a lot of people are doing their calls over AirPods and wireless, headsets. And I think that's ridiculous and insane and leads to cancer and tons of other diseases that are not fun to experience. As always, if you want to support the show, you can go to matt-blackburn.com. I have my CLF protocol under the blogs. I have a recipe page with PUFA-free donuts, pancakes, and homemade gummies. And all of my recommended products are up there, most of which have discount codes. And lately, especially with the heat wave that's coming through, I've been really enjoying the Bi-Ocean marine plasma shots from Shen Blossom. And these are just a really fun way to get your sodium chloride, but also some potassium, some magnesium, and the trace minerals, even some bioavailable copper in there. And you break one piece up one side of the vial, hold it over your mouth, you break the other side, and it creates a vacuum. And you get a shot of microfiltered, basically deep ocean water. And I like this in combination with the Panacea Shilajit tablets, and you're really covered with your trace minerals. But I feel that salt is really underlooked, and especially if you're under stress or if you're recovering from stress, or if it's just a really hot day, like it's been in the low 90s here in Idaho, it's really beneficial to keep up on the salt, and you really feel it. More stable energy, more stable mood. You definitely feel the reduction in stress if you just keep up with your salt intake because of that effect on aldosterone. And really exciting news with Mitolife, we just released Resiliency. It's a whole food vitamin C product with 3 ingredients: amla fruit, camu berry, and rose hips. And all 3 of those are very dense sources of vitamin C. Ascorbic acid, especially liposomal vitamin C, is trending right now, and it has been for several years. I've watched it over the last 5 years trending, and people, buying it off the shelf. Ascorbic acid, which on the label, it'll just say liposomal vitamin C, and it won't advertise in big letters, usually ascorbic acid, for a reason, because they're trying to convince you that ascorbic acid is vitamin C when it's not. It's just a part of vitamin C. It's like calling the frame of your car the car. It's not. It's just a part of your car. Just like ascorbic acid is only one part of vitamin C. In fact, Dr. Albert St. Georgi, the Nobel Prize laureate that discovered vitamin C, said this: ascorbic acid simply cannot confer vitamin activity. So what about ascorbigen? What about rutin? What about choline, K factors, P factors? What about tyrosinase and copper? There's all of these other pieces that work together to give the effect. And I think there's a time and a place for extracts and hyper extracts. Like, I'm a big fan of menaquinone 7, K2, vitamin K2. I'm a big fan of tocopherol, especially the alpha and the gamma. I like the mixed tocopherol. And those have been shown in the research to be very effective for especially lipid peroxidation, which is the big problem with PUFAs. And that really causes oxidative stress throughout the entire body and exacerbates pretty much every condition. But the cool thing about whole food vitamin C is it actually helps with that whole iron issue. The rutin in it actually prevents iron from binding to hydrogen peroxide. In doing so, it actually prevents what's called the Fenton reaction. And that breaks the chain reaction of causing extreme oxidative stress in the body. And actual graying of hair is a sure sign of copper deficiency, and you could say tyrosinase deficiency. So tyrosinase is an enzyme in vitamin C that contains bioavailable copper. And tyrosinase has a lot of effects. It actually initiates the oxidation or the transformation of the amino acid L-tyrosine into melanin. And each part of the vitamin C complex has its part to play, but ascorbic acid, for whatever reason, has got the limelight and took all the accolades when we forgot about the rutin, the ascorbigen, we forgot about the K factors, the P factors, the J factors, the tyrosinase, the copper, all of these other pieces that don't work in isolation, but work together to give the effect. So rutin is a bioflavonoid that I also use in the dissolvidol formula, the systemic enzyme formula, and that works really well with amla. So amla and rutin work really well together, and you can't take too much of it. And what I'm most fascinated by with vitamin C is its relationship to vitamin E. So we know that these are called antioxidants, and once vitamin E, the chain-breaking antioxidant, does its job and it's oxidized, vitamin C will actually regenerate it and allow it to keep doing its thing. And remember that vitamin C is water soluble. And so like copper, it's something that we should be ingesting every day. And thank goodness that whole food vitamin C contains copper, so we don't have to overthink it. But anyone with EMF exposure, anyone with sun exposure, which remember that ultraviolet light reacts with the polyunsaturated fats stored in the tissues, and that will increase lipid peroxidation and photoaging, photo damage, skin damage from ultraviolet light. A lot of that is initiated not only from the chemicals that people are slathering on through sunscreen, but with the omega-3 supplements that they're taking and the seed oils that they're cooking in. And all of this combines the canola oil that they're cooking in, the fish oil they're taking, and then all it takes is sunlight. And no wonder people are experiencing advanced skin aging, rapid skin aging, or advanced aging in general, because it's the perfect storm. So I believe that vitamin C with vitamin E is a great combo for any human being on planet Earth, because it will act as internal sunscreen. It will repair damage that's being caused to the cells as a result of stored PUFAs. And the effects are just so broad acting, even at regenerating the engines of the cell, the mitochondria. So whole food vitamin C has so many effects. If you have access to local ripe fruit, that's awesome. If you have good potatoes, that's also a great source of vitamin C. Good raw honey is a great source of vitamin C. But if you just want some extra, or in the winter, like in Idaho up here, we don't have any fresh fruit, then I think the berries, especially the dried berries in capsule form, are a really great way to go. And it's a great way to recover from, as I've experienced, 3 decades of just assaults from PUFA and and lipid peroxidation and iron overload. So thanks so much for listening. If you want to dive deeper into this material, you can head over to YouTube and check out my Mitolife Academy, where I release 4 videos a month of biohacking things, protocols, supplements that I'm enjoying. And I have a live Q&A once a month as well, where I talk about the latest things that I'm researching and experimenting with. See you on next Friday's show. Stay supercharged.